before I begin. If you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I'm telling you this the way it happened to me, with the windows open in my memory and the clock still ticking in my chest. Some families have heirlooms they pass down. Ours had rules. They were written in a kind of invisible ink you only see when you try to cross them. My parents called those rules standards, and they said standards were love with a backbone. I believed them, right up until the night my 10-year-old stood on their porch and learned how conditional a backbone can be. I'm the main character in this story, but the heart of it is my kid, Lila. She's small for her age, with a way of carrying her backpack like it's a second rib cage, something she needs to keep her upright. We'd been living in a one-bedroom that smelled like old paint and burnt toast, the kind of place where the radiator knocks like it's arguing with itself. It wasn't much, but it was ours, until the letter came with the red stamp and the polite words about unavoidable circumstances. The building was being sold. We had 30 days. I told myself 30 days is a long time when you're brave. It's not when you're tired. My parents live in the house I grew up in, a brick place with a porch swing that's been reupholstered so many times it's basically a family member. They always said the door was open. They always said family comes first. But they also always said I had a habit of making complicated choices. That's what they called my divorce, as if it were a hobby I picked up between yoga and sourdough. I tried to keep my pride intact like a china cup you don't use, but when the 30 days shrank into 3, I called them. My mom listened like she was taking notes she didn't plan to use. My dad cleared his throat the way he does before saying something that's supposed to sound like wisdom. They said we could talk when we came by. We packed 2 suitcases and a box of books. Lila insisted on bringing the plant she named Tuesday, even though it was more brown than green. It just needs a different window, she said, and I thought about how children believe in windows the way adults believe in deadlines. The drive to my parents' house was quiet, the kind of quiet that's not peace, but rehearsal. I practiced sentences in my head. I practiced gratitude. I practiced being smaller. The porch light was on. The swing creaked. My mom opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My dad stood behind her, already crossing his arms like he was guarding something. We hadn't even put the suitcases down when my mom said, "We need to talk about expectations." I remember the way Lila's hand found mine, how her fingers fit like punctuation, turning my fear into a sentence. They said it wouldn't be good for Lila to live there. They said their routine mattered. They said the neighborhood had changed and they were keeping things simple. My dad said, "We raised our kids. We're done raising." My mom said, "This isn't a hotel." I said, "It's not a hotel. It's your grandchild." The words landed like a glass on tile, and nobody bent to pick up the pieces. Lila's face did that thing where it tries to be brave and ends up being older than it should be. She asked if she could use the bathroom. My mom said, "Of course, honey," and then she looked at me and said, "But we need to be clear." Clear is a word that can mean kind or cruel depending on who gets to define it. They were clear. We couldn't stay. Not tonight, not for a few weeks, not until I got things sorted. They said there were motels. They said I was resourceful. They said, "We love you," the way people say goodbye to a bridge they're not going to cross. I don't remember picking up the suitcases. I remember the porch light buzzing. I remember the way my dad's shoes were lined up by the door like they were waiting for someone else. Lila came back from the bathroom with wet hands and a hopeful face that collapsed when she saw the suitcases again. She didn't cry right away. She asked, "Did I do something wrong?" And my mother said, "No, sweetie," too quickly, and my father looked at the floor like it was a map that might save him. We stood on the porch while the house behind us exhaled and closed. The door made a soft, final sound. Lila cried into my coat. I told her we'd figure it out. I told her I had a plan. I told her lies that were shaped like pillows. We sat in the car with the engine off because I needed a minute to remember how to breathe without breaking. That's when my phone buzzed. My great-grandma Ruth doesn't text, she calls. She called because she heard. I don't know how she always hears, only that she does. She's 93 and she keeps her hair in a silver bun like it's an argument she's already won. She said, "Where are you?" in a voice that's never been afraid of weather. I told her. There was a pause, and then she said, "Turn around." Ruth's house is smaller than my parents' and louder in a way that feels like life instead of rules. It smells like coffee and lemon and the soap she buys in bulk because she likes things that last. When we pulled up, she was already on the porch with a sweater draped over her shoulders like a flag. She didn't ask questions first. She hugged Lila, then me, then she said, "You can put your bags in the back room, the one with the good light." Inside, she made soup like it was a ritual that could hold us together. Lila sat at the table and told Ruth about Tuesday, the plant, and Ruth said, "We'll find it a better window," like that was a promise and a plan and a verdict all in one. I tried to thank her and ended up crying into my hands. She waited till my breath came back, and then she said, "They turned you away." I nodded. Ruth doesn't do that thing where people try to fix you with words. She does that thing where she fixes the world a little and then hands it back. She picked up the phone. She didn't ask me if I wanted her to. She said, "I need to call my lawyer." I laughed because it sounded like a joke from a different century. She didn't laugh. She said, "This isn't about money. This is about patterns." Her lawyer's name is Mr. Calder. He's been in Ruth's phone longer than I've been alive. She told him what happened in a voice that made it sound like a weather report. He listened. He asked a few questions. He said, "Let me look at something." When she hung up, she said, "Your parents have been very comfortable." Comfort is a dangerous thing when it gets confused with character. I learned that sitting at Ruth's table, listening to the clock tick like it was keeping score. Ruth told me a story I'd never heard, about a trust that had been set up years ago, about conditions and clauses that were supposed to encourage family to take care of family. She said, "Your grandfather believed in levers. Sometimes you need one." I didn't want leverage. I wanted my parents to open the door. I wanted them to remember the way they used to braid my hair and pack my lunches with notes that said, "You've got this." But wanting doesn't change architecture. Lila fell asleep on the couch with Tuesday on the windowsill, and I sat with Ruth and watched the house breathe. The next morning, my mom called like nothing had happened. She asked if we had found a place. I said we were with Ruth. There was a silence that felt like someone counting. My dad took the phone. He said, "We didn't mean it like that." I said, "You meant it exactly like that." He said, "Let's not make this a thing." That's when I understood that a thing is what people call consequences before they arrive. Ruth met me in the kitchen with 2 mugs and a look that said she was already ahead of the weather. She said, "Mr. Calder will come by. We're not suing anyone. We're reminding them who they said they were." I wanted to argue. I wanted to keep it quiet. I wanted to keep the family shape even if it hurt. Ruth put her hand over mine. She said, "Patterns don't change because you whisper at them." When Mr. Calder came, he sat at the table like it was a witness. He explained things in a way that felt like a map unfolding. He said the trust had provisions tied to family support, to the idea that no child would be turned away. He said sometimes paper remembers what people forget. He said there would be a letter. That afternoon, my parents showed up unannounced. My mom brought muffins like that could be a bridge. My dad stood in the doorway like he was measuring something invisible. They said they'd thought about it. They said maybe we could stay for a little while, but there would be rules. Ruth didn't raise her voice. She said, "The door is not a rental agreement." My mom's smile tightened. My dad said, "Is this really necessary?" And Ruth said, "It already is." Lila listened from the hall. Later, she asked if we were in trouble. I told her no. I told her sometimes adults need reminders that love is not a test you can pass by being comfortable. She nodded like she was filing it away for later, the way kids do with truths they're going to need. That night, I lay awake in the back room with the good light and listened to Ruth's house make its honest noises. I thought about doors. I thought about windows. I thought about patterns. and I knew with a certainty that felt like both relief and grief that whatever came next would not let us go back to the way things were. Some stories don't end when a door closes. Some of them begin when someone finally decides to knock from the inside. The letter arrived 3 days later in an envelope that looked too ordinary for the kind of weather it carried. Mr. Calder had warned us it would be plain. Serious things don't need decoration, he'd said, tapping the table like punctuation. Ruth set it down next to the fruit bowl and didn't open it right away. She made coffee first. She always does that, like the world is a machine that needs warming up before it can do anything honest. Leela sat at the table drawing a house with too many windows. She colored one window yellow and said, "That's the good light room." And I smiled like a person who had learned to hide bruises in plain sight. When Ruth finally opened the envelope, she didn't read it out loud. She read it the way people read instructions for a complicated tool, moving her lips without sound. Then she slid it across to me. It wasn't long, it was precise. It reminded my parents of promises that had been written down before promises felt optional. It explained that support for family wasn't a suggestion and that certain benefits they'd been enjoying were contingent on not treating children like inconvenient furniture. It said there would be a review. It said the review would be swift. It didn't threaten. It didn't have to. My phone started buzzing before I finished the last sentence. My mom's name came up like a reflex I hadn't trained out yet. I didn't answer. The second call was my dad. I let it ring until the kitchen felt bigger than it had any right to. Ruth watched me with the kind of patience that doesn't rush you into courage. When the call stopped, she said, "They'll come." They did, that afternoon, with a seriousness that felt borrowed. My mom didn't bring muffins this time. My dad's hands were empty, which was new. They sat on Ruth's couch like it was a bench in a station they didn't recognize. My mom started with apologies that had the word "if" tucked into them like a receipt you keep in case you need to return your conscience. My dad said, "We didn't realize," and then he stopped because realization is a word that sounds like it should do more than it usually does. Ruth listened, she nodded. She asked them one question, and she asked it the way you ask a mirror, not a person. When did love become a lease? My mom's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find a sentence that didn't require moving furniture inside herself. My dad said, "We were protecting our peace." Ruth said, "You protected your furniture." They asked if this was about money. Ruth said, "It's about memory." They asked if we could just forget the letter. Ruth said, "Paper is patient." They said they'd made a mistake. I believed them in the way you believe someone who has just learned the cost of a thing. Leela stood in the doorway and listened, and I hated that she was learning the shape of adult words like review and contingent before she learned how to ride her bike without training wheels. When they left, my mom hugged me too tight, like she was trying to squeeze the past back into place. My dad said, "We'll make it right," which is a sentence that sounds good because it doesn't specify how. The house exhaled again. Ruth put the kettle on. "They're afraid," she said. "Fear is a fast teacher, but it forgets." The review moved faster than anything I'd ever seen that involved paper. A week later, Mr. Calder called and said there would be adjustments. He didn't use the word penalties. He used the word reminders. My parents would feel them. He asked if we were okay. I said we were in a room with good light. He said, "That helps." My mom started calling every day. Sometimes she talked about the weather. Sometimes she talked about her book club. Sometimes she asked what Leela was learning in school. She didn't ask if we were coming back. My dad texted shorter things like "Hope you're well" and "Let's talk soon." I answered when I could. I didn't want to turn into a gatekeeper with a clipboard, but I also didn't want to pretend a door hadn't closed. Leela started school from Ruth's place. The bus stop was at the corner with the mailbox that leans like it's listening. The first morning, Ruth stood on the porch with her sweater like a flag again, and Leela waved from the steps like she was leaving for something important, which she was. In the afternoons, she'd come home with stories about a girl who traded her apple slices for stickers and a teacher who wrote her name with a star. She colored Tuesday in the sun and said, "See, different window." And I watched her learn that houses can change without people breaking. One night, as we were doing homework at the table, Leela asked, "Why didn't Grandma and Grandpa want us?" Children don't ask questions like they're trying to hurt you. They ask like they're trying to build a bridge with their hands. I said, "They forgot something important." She said, "Did they forget us?" I said, "No, they forgot how to be brave with love." She considered that like it was a math problem. Then she said, "Maybe they need homework." A few days later, my parents invited us over for dinner. The invitation came with a lot of words that tried to sound like a blanket. Ruth asked me what I wanted to do. I didn't know. There's a difference between forgiveness and amnesia, and nobody teaches you the choreography. Leela said, "Do they have my old room?" The way she said "my" made me realize how much she'd already stored in that word. I said we could go. We would bring dessert. We would leave early. The house looked the same from the outside. The porch swing creaked like a confession. Inside, my mom had moved things. The hallway table was gone. The guest room door was open. Leela's old drawings were on the fridge like someone had curated memory. My dad hovered like a man who had just learned where the fragile stickers go. Dinner was careful. My mom said, "We're so glad you're here," like it was a spell. My dad asked Leela about school. She told him about the star. He smiled like he was trying to remember how. After dessert, my mom said, "We made up the guest room." She said it like she was offering a seat on a bus. I said, "We're okay where we are." She nodded too fast. My dad said, "We want you to know the door is open." I looked at the door. It looked like a door. I said, "Doors are easy. It's thresholds that take practice." He nodded like he was writing that down somewhere inside. We left early. In the car, Leela said, "It smells the same." I said, "Some things do." She said, "But it feels different." I said, "Yeah, that's a whole conversation sometimes." The adjustment started to show up in ways my parents couldn't hide from themselves. They sold the second car. My mom canceled a trip. My dad started doing repairs himself instead of calling someone. They didn't say why. They didn't have to. When they came by Ruth's with a box of books they'd found in the attic, my mom said, "We're reorganizing." Ruth said, "That's a good habit." One afternoon, Mr. Calder stopped by with papers that needed signatures. He and Ruth talked in the kitchen like old gears that still fit. I sat with Leela and helped her with a science project about roots. She glued a picture of a tree and said, "The roots are the part you don't see that hold everything up." I said, "That's right." She said, "What if the roots get tired?" I said, "Then someone brings them water." She nodded like that was a solution. My parents started bringing water. Sometimes it was literal, like a casserole that fed 3 days. Sometimes it was awkward, like my dad offering to fix Ruth's fence and then realizing he'd never learned how. He learned. My mom asked Leela if she wanted to stay over. Leela said, "Can Tuesday come?" My mom said, "Of course," and I watched her learn to make room for a plant like it was a person, which in a way it was. We didn't move back, that wasn't the point. The point was that nobody pretended a door was the same as a welcome anymore. The review closed, the reminder stayed. My parents didn't talk about the trust, they talked about recipes. They talked about Leela's star, they talked about the fence. Sometimes my mom would look at me like she was measuring a bridge and wondering how much weight it could hold. I looked back like a person who knows bridges are built one plank at a time. One evening, Ruth and I sat on the porch and watched the light go gold. She said, "You did good." I said, "You did the heavy lifting." She said, "Levers are only useful if someone is willing to pull." I thought about patterns. I thought about homework. I thought about roots. The night stayed. The house breathed. And for the first time in a long while, the door didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like a choice that had to be practiced, which is a different kind of promise.
Spring came in sideways, the way it always does in Ruth's neighborhood, with a wind that smells like cut grass and a sun that can't decide if it's a promise or a rumor. Leela started leaving her jacket on the back of the chair like she was testing the idea of staying. I started waking up before the alarm, which is what happens when your body finally believes the floor will be there when you step on it. Ruth kept making soup like seasons don't change anything important. Consistency is a kind of love, she said once, stirring like she was underlining the sentence. My parents tried to be consistent too. They called before they came. They asked before they rearranged. They showed up to Leela's school play and sat in the second row, like they were learning where the lines were. My mom cried when Leela forgot one of her lines and then remembered it. My dad clapped too loud and then laughed at himself. We went out for ice cream afterward, and nobody said the word door. It sat between us anyway, like a ghost that had learned to wait. One afternoon, I found a box in Ruth's back room labeled in her careful handwriting, "Family Papers." It was heavier than it looked, like truth often is. Ruth was napping, so I didn't open it. Instead, I sat on the floor and thought about how many things we carry without looking at them. When she woke up, she made tea and said, "Curiosity is a polite knock." I laughed and told her about the box. She said, "We'll open it together." Inside were photos that had never made it to frames and letters that survived moves like stubborn plants. There was a picture of my mom as a kid, missing 2 teeth and holding a ribbon like it was a passport. There was a letter from my grandfather about work if kept him away longer than he meant. There was a folded document with a familiar name at the top, the trust. Ruth smoothed it like she was petting an old animal. "We don't read these to punish," she said. "We read them to remember why they exist." I asked her if she was tired of being the lever. She smiled like she'd been waiting for the question. "I'm tired of watching the door close on children," she said. "The rest is just paperwork." At school, Leela made a friend named Naomi who had a laugh like a bell and a backpack heavier than mine ever was. They did homework at the table and whispered like the table was a secret keeper. One day, Naomi asked why Leela lived with her great-grandma. Leela said, "Because she has the best light." Naomi said, "My grandma has the best cookies." Leela said, "We should introduce them." Children build communities like they're stacking blocks and don't know to call it resilience. My mom started asking if she could pick Leela up from school sometimes. The first time I said yes and then sat in the quiet like it was a test. They came back with stories about stickers and a library book about whales. My mom looked proud in a way that didn't need witnesses. My dad fixed the squeaky hinge on Ruth's screen door and didn't mention it. Ruth noticed anyway. She always does. One evening, my dad asked me to take a walk. We went past the mailbox that leans and the house with the blue shutters that always looks surprised. He said, "I've been thinking about that night." He didn't say porch. He didn't have to. He said, "I told myself I was protecting something." He kicked a pebble like it was a confession. "I think I was protecting a picture of myself." I said, "Pictures are flatter than people." He nodded like he was writing that down too. He asked if I was angry. I said, "Sometimes. Mostly I'm careful." He said, "I don't want to be someone you have to be careful around." I said, "Then don't be." It's a simple sentence that takes a long time to earn. Ruth had a small fall in the kitchen the next week. She laughed about it while we waited for the doctor like she was embarrassed by gravity. The doctor said it was a bruise and a reminder. Ruth said, "Reminders are popular these days." Leela drew her a card with a tree and roots and wrote, "Please don't fall. We need your light." Ruth taped it to the fridge like a treaty. The fall did something else. It rearranged our fear. My mom started coming by more, bringing soups she claimed were different but tasted like worry. My dad started checking in like he was learning a new language. We talked about practical things like schedules and rides and who would water Tuesday if we were gone. We talked about less practical things, like what it means to show up without a script. One night, after Leela went to bed, my mom said, "I was scared of doing it wrong." I said, "You did." She winced like she'd stepped on something sharp. I said, "And you can do it right tomorrow. Both things can be true." She nodded like she was learning how to hold 2 cups without dropping either. The school year ended with a picnic that smelled like sunscreen and hot dogs. Leela ran races and lost and didn't care. Ruth sat under a tree and told Naomi's grandma about a recipe that used more lemon than anyone thought reasonable. My parents sat on the blanket like people who were practicing not taking up too much space. When Leela got a ribbon for reading, she ran to all of us in a crooked line, and we clapped like we were trying to keep time with something bigger than ourselves. That summer, the question of moving came up like a mosquito you keep swatting at. My parents offered again. They had made room, they had rules, but they were written in pencil now. Ruth asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted a place that didn't feel like a test. She said, then stay until it doesn't. We stayed. Patterns don't break with fireworks. They break with dishes and rides to school and hinges that get oiled without announcements. My parents kept bringing water. Sometimes they spilled it, sometimes they forgot. They kept trying. That matters more than people admit. One afternoon, Leela asked if we could have a sleepover at my parents' house. She said it like she was asking if she could try on a coat. I said yes. We packed Tuesday. My mom had made up the guest room with a new lamp that tried very hard. Leela slept. I didn't much. In the morning, my dad made pancakes and burned the first one like a ritual offering. My mom laughed in a way that sounded like relief. When we left, Leela hugged them and said, "See you soon," like it was a bridge she could cross without counting planks. Ruth asked me how it went. I said, "We're learning." She said, "Good. Learning is louder than apologies." That night, I found the family papers box back where it had been. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Some levers do their work and then become furniture again, useful in quiet ways. By late summer, the air had learned how to sit on your shoulders without asking, and Ruth's porch became our evening classroom. We'd bring out iced tea and whatever book Lila was reading and pretend the cicadas were applause. The neighborhood kids biked in loops like they were drawing borders with their wheels. My parents came by more often, sometimes together, sometimes like two people practicing harmony in separate rooms. They didn't announce improvements, they just did things. My dad fixed the loose step, my mom organized Ruth's pantry and pretended it was about labels, not nerves. I kept waiting for the other shoe, because I'm the kind of person who hears quiet and checks for storms. But the quiet stayed, not the empty kind, more like a room where someone has finally put the pictures back up. Lila started leaving small notes for my parents in her handwriting that still wobbled like a newly planted tree. "Thank you for the pancakes. I like the lamp. Tuesday is growing." My mom taped them inside a cabinet like she was building a museum to ordinary days. Then a letter came that wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the school district about a program Lila had been nominated for, an after-school reading group that met across town. Transportation would be an issue. Ruth's doctor had added words like rest to her vocabulary, and my work hours weren't flexible the way Hope wants them to be. I stood at the counter and did the math that never adds up right. My parents offered to drive. I hesitated like it was a reflex I hadn't trained out yet. My mom said, "We can make it routine." My dad said, "Put it on our calendar." The word routine sat there like a promise you could measure. The first week they showed up early. The second week my dad brought the wrong snack and Lila laughed like he told a joke. The third week traffic was bad and my mom called to say they'd still be there just later, and she sounded like she meant more than the sentence. I started to feel the shape of trust, which is less like a leap and more like stepping stones you test with your foot. Ruth watched it all like a weather station. "You're building a bridge," she said one night, stirring soup like it was a map. "Just remember who gets to set the toll." I said, "What's the toll?" She said, "Showing up again." One afternoon, I got a call at work. Lila had tripped during recess and scraped her knee. Nothing serious, but she wanted knee. My parents were closer. They went.
My mom stayed with her in the nurse's office and told her a story about falling off a bike when she was 8. My dad signed the form. When I got there, Lila was already smiling through a bandage like it was a badge. My mom looked at me like she was asking permission with her eyes. I said, "Thank you." It felt like putting a brick in place and not having it wobble. We had dinner together that weekend at Ruth's, all of us, like a rehearsal for something that used to be automatic. My mom brought a pie. My dad brought a tool he thought might fix a thing that wasn't broken. Ruth told a story about my grandfather that ended with her rolling her eyes and everyone laughing like the laugh had been waiting. Lila asked if we could do it again. The table agreed. There are setbacks. There always are. One Sunday, my parents canceled last minute because of something vague that sounded like old priorities wearing new clothes. Lila tried not to notice. I noticed. I said something. My dad called back later and said he'd made the wrong call. He came by with a book for Lila and an apology that didn't have any receipts tucked into it. We went for a walk and he said, "I'm practicing." I said, "So am I." At work, I got offered more hours. More hours mean more money and less daylight. I did the math again. Ruth said, "We'll adjust." My parents said, "We can cover Tuesdays and Thursdays." We put it on a calendar like it was a treaty. Lila colored the boxes with stars and said, "These are the good days." I said, "Most days can be." She said, "But these have rides." The reading group became a small miracle. Lila came home talking about chapters like they were rooms she'd visited. She read to Ruth in the evenings, and Ruth pretended not to correct her when she missed a word, because sometimes pride needs a longer leash. My mom started asking Lila what she was reading and then actually reading it. My dad listened like he was learning a new song. One evening after Lila went to bed, my mom asked if we could talk. We sat on the porch where the swing creaks like it's keeping secrets. She said, "I keep thinking about that night." She didn't say porch either. I said, "Me too." She said, "I thought I was setting boundaries." She twisted her hands like they were trying to apologize on their own. "I think I was building walls." I said, "Walls are easy, doors are work." She nodded like she'd been waiting for a sentence to stand in. She asked if I would ever trust her the way I used to. I said, "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward." She said, "What does that look like?" I said, "It looks like you keep showing up when it's inconvenient." She smiled like someone who has finally been given a job description. Ruth's doctor added more words to her vocabulary. None of them were dramatic, but together they spelled a kind of caution. We talked about practical things. We talked about backup plans. We talked about who would water Tuesday if nobody remembered. My parents listened like students. They took notes in their phones like it was a class they were afraid to fail. Then came the school fundraiser. There were sign-up sheets and folding tables and a raffle prize nobody wanted. Lila volunteered us like it was a group sport. My parents took a shift. Ruth made lemon bars and wrote the recipe on a card like it was a will. We stood behind the table and sold tickets and told people about the reading group like it was a secret we wanted to spread. When Lila's class won a small trophy for participation, she held it like it was a lantern. On the drive home, she said, "It feels like we're a team." I said, "We are." She said, "Even Grandma and Grandpa?" I said, "Especially when they practice." She said, "Practice is when you mess up and keep going, right?" I said, "Exactly." She nodded like she was filing it away with roots and windows. The fall festival came with hay bales and a dunk tank that took itself very seriously. My dad volunteered to sit in the chair. He wore a ridiculous hat and pretended to be brave. Lila hit the target on the third try and laughed like she'd solved a puzzle. My mom took pictures like she was trying to capture proof of effort. Ruth sat with Naomi's grandma and judged pies with a seriousness that made strangers smile. Later, as we were packing up, my dad said, "We're thinking about the holidays." He said it carefully, like he was testing a bridge with his toe. "We don't want to assume." I said, "We'll talk." He said, "Okay." It was a small word that did a lot of work. That night, Ruth and I sat in the kitchen with the light that makes everything look honest. She said, "You see how it goes?" I said, "Slow." She said, "Slow is how you keep dishes from breaking." I said, "Are you worried?" She said, "I'm always worried. It keeps me paying attention." We made a plan that wasn't a plan, more like a list of things to remember. Lila first, doors second, paper last. Ruth put it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pear. She said, "For sweetness." A week later, my parents asked if Lila could stay with them for a weekend. A whole weekend. We talked about it like it was a weather forecast. Lila packed Tuesday, 3 books, and a stuffed animal that has seen things. I wrote down emergency numbers like I was sending her to another country. My parents promised routines. My dad promised pancakes. Ruth promised to call and ask if Tuesday was getting enough sun. The weekend passed with pictures and texts and one call about a missing sock that turned into a joke. When Lila came back, she said, "We made cookies and burned some and ate them anyway." She said, "The lamp is still trying." She said, "Grandpa fixed the hinge again even though it wasn't squeaky." I said, "That's his love language." She said, "What's yours?" I said, "Maps." She said, "I like snacks." Ruth watched her and smiled like someone who has just seen a plant take. She said, "See? Different window." I thought about the porch light buzzing and the door closing and the way stories can turn if someone insists on pulling a lever and then letting it go. The holidays loomed like a question with a lot of punctuation. We decided to split them, not because we had to, but because it felt like a bridge that didn't ask for a toll. My parents didn't argue. They asked what would make it easier. I told them. They wrote it down. Some nights I still wake up and listen for doors, but more often I hear the house breathing and Lila turning a page and Ruth's kettle clicking off like a small victory. Trust is not a ribbon you win, it's a habit you build. The holidays arrived with a kind of careful optimism, like everyone had agreed to carry glass instead of throwing it. We started with Ruth's place because traditions need a center of gravity. The kitchen smelled like lemon and sugar and the quiet bravery of recipes that have been made too many times to remember who taught them first. My parents came early and stayed a little late, which felt like a sentence learning to finish itself. Leela wore the sweater my mom had bought her that tried very hard to be both warm and festive, and she kept touching the sleeve like it was proof. We set the table with the good plates that Ruth only brings out when she wants to remind us that ordinary days can be upgraded. My dad volunteered to carve and took it seriously enough that Ruth had to tell him to breathe. My mom floated between rooms like she was checking for drafts in places that used to let cold in. When we sat down, there was a moment where everyone waited for someone else to speak, like a choir that had forgotten the first note. Leela said, "Can we say what we're thankful for?" And the table agreed because children can do that. Ruth went first and said, "Light." My dad said, "Second chances." My mom said, "Being taught how to show up." I said, "Maps." Leela said, "Cookies that we burn and eat anyway." We laughed, and the laugh didn't trip over anything. After dessert, my parents asked if we'd come over the next day. We did. Their house had been rearranged again, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that suggested someone had been practicing seeing space differently. The guest room had a small desk now. Leela ran her hand over it like it was a new chapter. My mom said, "For homework if you want." Leela said, "Can Tuesday sit here?" My mom said, "He has a chair." We stayed for dinner and left before the roads got shiny. In the car, Leela said, "It's like we have 2 homes." I said, "It's like we have 2 kitchens and 1 backpack." She said, "And 1 plant." I said, "Exactly." January came with lists. Work lists, school lists, doctor lists. Ruth's name was on a few more of them than before, and that made the air feel thinner. We adjusted. My parents took over some drives without being asked. My mom started keeping a spare set of Leela's clothes in her trunk like a quiet promise. My dad learned the names of Leela's teachers and said them right the first time, which is a kind of respect you can measure. One afternoon, I found my mom sitting at Ruth's table with the family papers box open. She looked up like she'd been caught reading someone's diary. I said, "It's okay." She said, "I just wanted to understand." We sat together and looked at photos like they were windows. She stopped at one of herself as a kid with the ribbon. "I was so sure I knew how things were supposed to go," she said. I said, "Supposed to is a strong word." She nodded like she was setting it down. That week, Leela brought home a note about a field trip that needed chaperones. I signed up without thinking. My mom did too. My dad asked if there was a wait list. There was. He put his name on it like he was buying a ticket to a concert he'd once pretended not to like. On the bus, Leela sat between us and told us facts about Wales like she was hosting a show. My mom took pictures. I took notes because I always do. When one of the kids got carsick, my dad had napkins ready like he'd been rehearsing for emergencies. Ruth's doctor added more words. We added more checkboxes. We didn't say the word that everyone hears in a different voice. We said things like support and schedule and next appointment. My parents didn't disappear into their own fear. They showed up to it. My mom brought soup. My dad brought a chair he fixed that didn't need fixing. Ruth teased him and then used it. One evening, after Leela was asleep, my dad asked if we could talk about the trust. The word felt heavier than it used to. I said, "What about it?" He said, "I don't want it to be the reason we do the right thing." I said, "Then don't let it be." He said, "I don't want Leela to think love comes with footnotes." I said, "Then write it in the main text." He smiled like someone who had just learned a language has more than one tense. We talked about wills and plans and boring things that are actually a kind of mercy. We talked about what would happen if Ruth needed more than we could give at home. We talked about how to say hard sentences without turning them into walls. My mom listened like she was taking notes on how to breathe. We didn't solve everything. We put some things on the fridge with the paramagnet. February brought snow that forgot how to be romantic and decided to be heavy instead. The bus was late. The reading group moved online for a week. Leela built a snow fort and named it Tuesday's Castle. Ruth watched from the window and laughed like the world had told a good joke. My parents came over with groceries and stayed to shovel like they were trying to earn the weather's respect. One night, the power went out. We lit candles and played cards and told stories about dumb things we'd done as kids. My mom admitted she once tried to dye her hair with something that wasn't meant for hair. My dad admitted he failed a driving test because he waved at the wrong person. Leela laughed like she'd discovered adults are a genre. When the lights came back, nobody rushed to turn them all on. In March, Ruth had another fall, smaller than the last, but it rearranged the air again. The doctor said more words that sounded like furniture. We moved some. My parents asked if Ruth could stay with them for a bit if she needed. Ruth said, "I like my light." My mom said, "We can make a good one." Ruth said, "Let's see." The sentence held more than it showed. Leela's reading group invited parents and grandparents to a small celebration. Ruth went in her good sweater. My parents sat together like they'd finally agreed on a bench. Leela read a page out loud and didn't rush. When she finished, she looked for us like she was counting anchors. We were all there. The teacher said something about community. I wrote it down, even though I already knew the word. After, my mom said, "We were thinking about the summer." She said it carefully like she was testing the edge of a pool with her toe. "There's a program near us, day camp. We could drive her." Leela's eyes did that thing where plans become pictures. I said, "Let's look at it." We did. We made a spreadsheet because that's my love language. We argued about snacks and won. In April, Ruth started leaving her sweater on the chair more often. The house breathed differently. My parents started cooking more at our place than theirs. My dad fixed the mailbox that leans and pretended it was about screws. My mom reorganized a drawer that didn't ask to be reorganized. Ruth watched and said, "You're nesting." My mom said, "Is that allowed?" Ruth said, "It's encouraged." One Saturday, Leela brought home a note about a field trip that needed chaperones. I signed up without thinking. My mom did too. My dad asked if there was a wait list. There was. He put his name on it like he was buying a ticket to a concert he'd once pretended not to like. On the bus, Leela sat between us and told us facts about whales like she was hosting a show. My mom took pictures. I took notes because I always do. When one of the kids got carsick, my dad had napkins ready like he'd been rehearsing for emergencies. Ruth's doctor added more words. We added more checkboxes. We didn't say the word that everyone hears in a different voice. We said things like support and schedule and next appointment. My parents didn't disappear into their own fear. They showed up to it. My mom brought soup. My dad brought a chair he fixed that didn't need fixing. Ruth teased him and then used it. One evening, after Leela was asleep, my dad asked if we could talk about the trust. The word felt heavier than it used to. I said, "What about it?" He said, "I don't want it to be the reason we do the right thing." I said, "Then don't let it be." He said, "I don't want Leela to think love comes with footnotes." I said, "Then write it in the main text." He smiled like someone who had just learned a language has more than one tense. We talked about wills and plans and boring things that are actually a kind of mercy. We talked about what would happen if Ruth needed more than we could give at home. We talked about how to say hard sentences without turning them into walls. My mom listened like she was taking notes on how to breathe. We didn't solve everything. We put some things on the fridge with the paramagnet. February brought snow that forgot how to be romantic and decided to be heavy instead. The bus was late. The reading group moved online for a week. Leela built a snow fort and named it Tuesday's Castle. Ruth watched from the window and laughed like the world had told a good joke. My parents came over with groceries and stayed to shovel like they were trying to earn the weather's respect. One night, the power went out. We lit candles and played cards and told stories about dumb things we'd done as kids. My mom admitted she once tried to dye her hair with something that wasn't meant for hair. My dad admitted he failed a driving test because he waved at the wrong person. Leela laughed like she'd discovered adults are a genre. When the lights came back, nobody rushed to turn them all on. In March, Ruth had another fall, smaller than the last, but it rearranged the air again. The doctor said more words that sounded like furniture. We moved some. My parents asked if Ruth could stay with them for a bit if she needed. Ruth said, "I like my light." My mom said, "We can make a good one." Ruth said, "Let's see." The sentence held more than it showed. Leela's reading group invited. Summer arrived like a door you forget to lock because you've been practicing openness. The mornings got earlier without asking, and the evenings learned how to stretch. Camp became a rhythm. Pack, drive, wave, pick up, unpack stories. My parents kept the rhythm like they were learning a song by ear. My mom made a playlist for the drives and pretended it was for traffic, not courage. My dad started bringing a cooler with ice packs, like preparedness was a personality trait he'd finally claimed. Ruth sat on the porch with her sweater, even when it wasn't necessary, which is her way of reminding the weather that she's older than it is. She waved at the car like she was sending off a ship. When we came back, she asked Leela for one story, not all of them, because she believes in leaving room for tomorrow. Leela chose stories like she was picking postcards from a stack. Today, a counselor who could whistle. Tomorrow, a bug that looked like a leaf. Always something about snacks. The day camp trip my parents had mentioned turned into a week by a lake with cabins that smelled like pine and ambition. We talked about it at the table with the good light. We talked about schedules and sunscreen and emergency contacts. We talked about what would make Leela feel brave and what would make me sleep. My parents didn't push. They offered to handle the driving and half the packing like it was a shared puzzle. Ruth said, "Take pictures of the water," like water had a union and required documentation. We decided to go, not because it was perfect, but because it was a bridge we could test with more than one foot. The night before we left, Leela lined up her clothes like she was staging a parade. She put Tuesday on the windowsill and said, "Be good." Ruth promised to water and report. My mom left a list on the fridge that said things like snacks and batteries and don't forget the hat, and I added maps because that's my love language and also because I wanted the fridge to remember me. The drive was long enough for playlists to get philosophical. Leela asked questions like she was collecting postcards from our answers. Are lakes just big cups? My dad said, some of them are. My mom said, some of them are mirrors. I said, some of them are maps. Leela said, can they be all three? We agreed that most good things are. At the cabins, we unpacked and argued gently about which bed was closest to the window. My parents took the one that had a creaky frame and pretended it was about acoustics. The first night, we cooked something that tried very hard and succeeded enough. We sat by the water and watched it do what water does when it's not being asked questions. Leela skipped stones and counted like she was measuring patience. My mom took pictures. My dad built a small fire and then worried about it like a person who loves responsibility but is still learning its shape. The days filled themselves with small things that add up. Canoes, sandwiches, a sudden rain that turned into a lesson about towels. Leela learned to paddle without making the boat argue. My dad learned to let her try before offering advice. My mom learned to sit on the dock and watch without narrating. I learned to breathe without checking the time like it was a test. One afternoon, Leela scraped her elbow on a rock and tried to pretend it was nothing because she wanted to get back in the water. My mom cleaned it like she was performing a ceremony. My dad told a story about a time he'd done the same thing and made it sound like a badge, not a mistake. Leela listened and then said, okay, like she'd made a decision to accept care without negotiating. At night, when Leela slept, my parents and I sat by the dying fire and talked about things that don't need witnesses. My mom said, I keep thinking about that door. My dad said, me too. I said, me three. We didn't say more for a while. The water did what water does. Then my dad said, I was afraid of failing. My mom said, I was afraid of being needed in a way I couldn't schedule. I said, I was afraid of believing you. We let the sentences sit like stones in a pocket, heavy but chosen. On the way home, the car was quieter in the way that means everyone is storing something useful. Ruth met us on the porch like she was checking a horizon. She hugged Leela and then hugged the rest of us like she was distributing approval in careful portions. Leela told Ruth one story and saved the rest. Tuesday got watered and looked like it was trying to say thank you. A week later, Ruth had a day that asked for more chairs. We didn't say the word everyone hears. We said, let's sit. My parents came without being asked. My mom brought soup. My dad brought a notebook and wrote down what the doctor said like he was translating. Ruth listened and then said, I'd like to keep my light. My mom said, we'll make sure you do. My dad said, we'll figure out how. The sentence felt like a bridge with more than one plank. We started rotating nights, who stayed, who cooked, who took Leela to camp and back. It wasn't dramatic, it was logistical. That's how care often looks when it's serious. Leela made charts with stars and insisted on stickers for everyone. My dad pretended not to care about stickers and then checked if his was crooked. There were hard days, days when Ruth was tired in a way that made the room quieter, days when my mom cried in the kitchen because she remembered a different kitchen, days when my dad forgot to call and then showed up with apologies that didn't try to be funny, days when I snapped at nobody in particular because the floor felt like it was shifting. We kept the charts, we kept the soup, we kept the habit of showing up. One evening, as I was washing dishes, my mom said, do you think we're doing enough? I said, enough is a moving target. She said, I keep thinking about the trust. I said, paper can remind you where the road is. It can't make you walk.
She nodded like she was writing it somewhere that didn't need a notebook. Leela started spending more afternoons at my parents' place again, not as a test, but as a routine. She did homework at the small desk, she watered a plant that wasn't Tuesday and said, "You're a cousin." My dad fixed a hinge again and said it was thinking about squeaking. My mom started leaving notes in Leela's lunch that said things like, "You've got this," and I pretended not to notice how old the sentence was and how new it felt. Ruth's doctor suggested a few changes. We made them. We moved a rug, we added a rail, we put a lamp in a place that made the evening feel less like a question. My parents didn't argue about costs, they argued about where to put things. That's progress you can measure with a tape. There was a day when Leela forgot her backpack at my parents' house and realized it halfway home. She didn't cry. She said, "We can turn around." My mom turned the car around without narrating the weather. My dad met us at the door with the backpack like he had been waiting for a cue. Leela said, "Thanks," and ran back to the car like she was practicing trust with sneakers on. At work, I got offered a different schedule, more pay, more evenings. I brought it to the table like a question with a lot of punctuation. My parents offered to cover more drives. Ruth said, "Take the work that keeps you kind." I took the schedule that let me come home before the kettle clicked off. We adjusted the charts, we added stickers. My dad pretended not to care about stickers again. Late one night, my dad and I fixed the mailbox that leans, again. He said, "It keeps wanting to listen." I said, "Maybe it's learning." He laughed and then said, "I'm still scared of messing up." I said, "Me too." He said, "Does it ever stop?" I said, "I think it turns into paying attention." He nodded like he had been waiting for that sentence. My mom started volunteering at Leela's reading group like she was trying to learn a new dialect. She brought snacks that were always slightly wrong and always appreciated. She learned the names of the kids and the rules of the room. One afternoon she told me, "I didn't know how loud quiet could be." I said, "It gets quieter when you listen." Ruth had a good day that felt like a gift someone had wrapped in ordinary paper. She sat on the porch and told a story about my grandfather that ended with her laughing at herself. Leela brought her a drawing of the lake that looked like a mirror that had learned to smile. My parents sat on the steps like they were sharing a bench. The air did that thing where it feels like it's been forgiven. In August, there was a neighborhood potluck that tried to be simple and ended up being ambitious. We went as a group like we were testing a sentence in public. People asked questions in that gentle way that means they're curious but not hungry for details. Ruth answered some, Leela answered others. My mom and dad handed out plates like they were passing out resumes for being normal. We laughed more than we planned to. On the walk home, Leela said, "It feels like we're all walking the same speed." I said, "That's rare." She said, "We should keep practicing." I said, "We will." Then came the call we'd been pretending wasn't on the calendar. Ruth had another day that asked for more chairs, and this time the words didn't dance around themselves. We sat at the table with the good light and said the word everyone hears. We said it like a plan, not a sentence. My mom cried. My dad held her. Leela asked if Ruth would still tell stories. Ruth said, "If you bring me tea." We talked about options. We talked about timing. We talked about what it means to keep light in a room when rooms change. My parents didn't hide behind logistics. They stepped into them. They offered their house. Ruth said, "I like my light." My mom said, "We can move it." Ruth said, "Let's try." The sentence felt like a bridge with more than one plank. We didn't move right away. We started with weekends. We practiced the route. We practiced where to put shoes. We practiced not making it feel like a test. Leela made signs with arrows that said kitchen and bathroom, like she was hosting a museum. My dad put one on the fridge that said light. The first weekend, Ruth slept in the room with the new lamp and said, "It's ambitious."
September settled into October like the house was learning a new breath. The leaves started doing that quiet, brave thing where they let go without asking for permission, and Ruth's porch became a classroom again. Only this time, the lessons were about timing. We kept the weekends at my parents' place going, slowly, like you keep a fire going by feeding it small pieces instead of a whole log. Leela called it grandma practice, and Ruth pretended to be offended until she admitted she liked the word practice better than trial. The first real test came on a Tuesday that refused to be simple. I got called into work early. The school had an unexpected half day because of a broken pipe that turned the hallway into a roomer. Ruth had a doctor's appointment that had been moved up. My parents were already in traffic for something they couldn't reschedule. For about 5 minutes, the world felt like one of those puzzles where you realize a piece is missing and you don't know which box it fell into. We solved it with phone calls and a kind of calm that only shows up when you've practiced being scared. My mom turned around, my dad rerouted, Ruth waited, Leela sat on the front steps with her backpack and told Tuesday the plant that adventures were mostly about patience. When my parents arrived, they didn't make a show of it, they just did the thing. My mom signed the form, my dad brought snacks, they took Ruth to her appointment after picking Leela up, and the three of them came back with a story about a dog in the waiting room that had a better haircut than any of us. The day held. That's the miracle people forget to name. At dinner that night, Ruth said, "See, we're building muscle." My dad said, "I feel it." My mom said, "In places I didn't know were muscles." Leela said, "Does Tuesday have muscles?" We decided Tuesday had aspirations. The weekends stretched into longer stays at my parents' place for Ruth. We moved a few more things, a lamp, a blanket that smells like lemon and old afternoons, the small radio she likes because it makes the news sound like it's being told by someone who remembers faces. My parents tried very hard not to treat it like a countdown. They asked where things should go. They asked before they fixed. They learned that asking is a kind of repair. One evening, my mom found a box in the garage with my old notebooks. She brought them inside like she was returning a library book. "Do you want these?" she asked. I said, "Maybe." Leela opened one and read a sentence I'd written when I was about her age, about wanting a window seat. She said, "You always liked windows." I said, "I guess I did." My mom looked at me like she was seeing a map she'd once folded away. Ruth had a good stretch, the kind that makes you forget to count days. We took advantage of it without saying we were. We went to the farmer's market and argued about apples. We went to the library and pretended not to judge covers. Leela got a library card with her name printed on it, like a small certificate of belonging. My parents took pictures like they were collecting proof of ordinary happiness. Ruth bought honey and said it was for winter, even though winter was still practicing. At school, Leela's teacher asked if we'd come in to talk about a small leadership role in the reading group. "She helps the quieter kids," she said. I wrote it down, even though it was a sentence that deserved to be memorized. My parents came too. They sat in chairs that squeaked and didn't pretend not to hear it. On the way out, my dad said, "She gets that from you." I said, "She gets it from practice." He nodded like he was filing that away. Then came the call from my parents that didn't start with weather. My dad said, "We want to talk about something." My mom said, "It's not bad." We met at their kitchen table, the one that has seen more arguments than pies. They said they'd been looking at their finances. They said the adjustments from the trust were still there, but they weren't the point anymore. My mom said, "We want to set something up for Leela, not as leverage, as a promise." My dad said, "For school, or whatever she wants to build." The word build did a lot of work. I felt my shoulders do that thing they do when they've been holding a roof without noticing. I said, "Thank you." My mom said, "We're not trying to buy forgiveness." I said, "Good, because you can't." My dad smiled like he was relieved to hear it out loud. We talked about boring details. We talked about who would be on the paperwork. We talked about how to explain it to Leela in a way that didn't make it sound like a trophy. Ruth came by with soup like she was the punctuation in the room. She listened and then said, "Make sure it doesn't have footnotes." My mom said, "Main text only." Ruth nodded like a judge who had just stamped something with approval. A few days later, Leela asked why everyone was whispering in kitchens again. I told her we were planning for the future. She said, "Is the future scary?" I said, "Sometimes." She said, "Is it also snacks?" I said, "Often." She said, "Okay."
That's how children accept the shape of things, by finding where the snacks fit. The real turning point didn't come with papers or speeches. It came on a Sunday morning when my dad forgot his phone at home and realized it halfway to the store. He came back, annoyed at himself, and found Ruth trying to reach him because the kettle was making a sound it shouldn't. He fixed it. They laughed. My mom said, "We should label that cord." Ruth said, "We should label you useful." My dad pretended to be offended and then wore the word like a badge. It was a small scene. It felt like a cornerstone. Later that week, the school sent home forms about a winter trip. Nothing dramatic, just a museum and a long bus ride. Leela wanted to go. I looked at the calendar like it was a puzzle. My parents said, "We've got it." Ruth said, "Bring me a postcard even if it's just a magnet." Leela said, "I'll bring you a rock if they let me." They probably wouldn't, but we didn't correct her because hope is also a souvenir. One night, after everyone else was asleep, I stood in my parents' kitchen and looked at the door. The same door, different hinges, or maybe the same hinges, just oiled. I thought about the porch light buzzing and the way my daughter's face had folded into my coat. I thought about Ruth's phone call and the word patterns and the way paper remembers. I thought about how none of this had been fast, and that was the point. My mom came in quietly and stood next to me. She said, "I used to think love was something you could organize." I said, "You can, you just can't file it." She smiled like she was relieved to not have to. The next weekend, we tried a full week at my parents' place for Ruth. We packed like we were moving, but kept telling ourselves we weren't. The room with the new lamp got a few more of her things. The radio found a spot. The blanket found the chair. The house learned a new rhythm. Ruth corrected my dad on how to make tea, and he accepted it as a promotion. There were moments when it felt crowded, moments when everyone wanted the same quiet. We handled them like people who had learned the cost of pretending. We took walks, we made lists, we let Leela narrate her day like it was a show, because sometimes narration is how you keep things from spilling. Midweek, Ruth had a rough afternoon. My mom sat with her and held her hand. My dad made soup and burned the first batch and tried again. Leela did homework at the small desk and whispered the hard words before saying them out loud. I sat on the steps and listened to the house breathe and realized that this was the sound I'd been waiting for, a house that didn't need to pretend. On Friday, Ruth said, "I think I could do this." My mom said, "We can adjust." My dad said, "We'll keep the light." Leela said, "And Tuesday can visit." We laughed because laughter is sometimes a way of agreeing without writing it down. We didn't announce a move. We didn't post a timeline. We just kept practicing. The charts changed, the stickers multiplied, the mailbox still leaned, the hinge still didn't squeak, the kettle clicked off like it was keeping score. At school, Leela got another star. She ran to all of us in a crooked line again. This time, my parents were already standing together, not because they'd planned it, but because they'd learned where to stand. Ruth sat with Naomi's grandma and judged nothing but the weather. I took a picture and didn't write a note because some things don't need to be saved in more than one place. That night, as we were driving home, Leela said, "It feels like the house is bigger." I said, "Which one?" She said, "All of them." I said, "That's a good problem." She said, "Can we keep it?" I said, "We're trying." The door that had once closed on us still existed. It always will. But it had become something else. Not a verdict, not a threat, just a door doing its job in a house that was finally learning what its job was too. And for the first time since that night on the porch, I realized I wasn't measuring the distance to the door anymore. I was measuring how far we'd come from it. Winter arrived the way it always does here. Quiet at first, like it's asking permission, and then all at once like it never needed it. The first snow made the mailbox lean even more, and my dad said it gave the house character. My mom said the house already had plenty of character and handed him a shovel.
Ruth watched from the window with the radio on low, the news sounding like a letter from someone who still remembered our names. Leela pressed her face to the glass and drew a heart that immediately fogged into something that looked like a map. "That's us," she said, and then she ran to find her boots. We didn't announce anything, but by then everyone knew what the practice had become. Ruth stayed most nights. The spare room stopped being spare. The lamp settled into its corner like it had been born there. The blanket stopped smelling like lemon in old afternoons and started smelling like soup and pages. My parents learned Ruth's medicines like a language you don't speak perfectly but try to pronounce with respect. I learned where my dad keeps the extra batteries. My mom learned that Leela takes her cocoa with more milk than she admits. The house learned all of us. The museum trip came and went with the drama of a forgotten lunch and the triumph of a postcard with a dinosaur on it that Ruth taped to the fridge like it was a certificate. "Proof of civilization," she said. My dad said, "Which one?" And she said, "Ours, obviously." Leela brought home a magnet instead of a rock and declared it close enough. We didn't argue. The paperwork took longer than anyone wanted and less time than I feared. We sat at a desk that had seen other promises and signed things that tried very hard to look like the future. My parents asked if we wanted to read every line. I said yes, because some lines deserve to be read. Ruth squeezed my hand and said, "No footnotes," and everyone laughed like it was a ritual we were grateful to keep. There was a small ceremony that only happened because Leela demanded it. She lined us up in the living room and said we needed to promise out loud. My dad tried to make a speech and my mom cut him off and promised first. Ruth promised to keep the radio at a reasonable volume. I promised to keep asking before assuming. Leela promised to tell us if Tuesday the plant needed water, and then, after a pause, promised to tell us if she did too. We all said yes at the same time, like a chorus that had practiced without realizing it. The old porch light finally burned out, and my dad replaced it with one that didn't buzz. He stood on the ladder and said, "Moment of silence for the old one," and we gave it a respectful second. When he flicked the switch, the light came on clean and steady. My mom said, "Well," like it meant something, and also like it didn't need to be explained. There were still hard days. Ruth had one in January that made us all quiet. My mom canceled a lunch. My dad burned the soup again and didn't apologize. Leela sat on the rug and read out loud in a voice that made the words behave. I sat in the hallway and counted the spaces between footsteps and realized that this, too, was a kind of work. When it passed, Ruth said, "Thank you for not making a speech," and we didn't. School kept being school. Leela kept being the kid who helps the quiet ones. Her teacher sent another note, and I folded it into my wallet like a map I wanted to keep close. My parents went to a school assembly and clapped at the wrong times and the right ones, and then asked 100 questions in the car like they were studying for a test they actually cared about. One evening, my mom brought out my old notebooks again and put them back where she'd found them, only this time she left one on the coffee table. "In case you want to write," she said, and then she pretended to look for something in the other room. I opened it and wrote a sentence about doors that become rooms if you stay long enough. I didn't show it to anyone. Some sentences are like seeds. You don't dig them up to see if they're working. We had dinner with Naomi's grandma, who brought a pie that had opinions. She said, "You all look settled," like it was a diagnosis. Ruth said, "We're practicing." And Naomi's grandma said, "That's how you get good at things." And then she asked for the radio to be turned up a little bit because she likes the weather told like a story. Leela served pie like she was in charge of a small, important institution. The snow melted into that gray honesty that winter does so well, and then one morning the crocuses showed up like punctuation. My dad said, "They're early." My mom said, "They're brave." Ruth said, "They're tired of waiting." Leela said, "They're like us," and nobody corrected her. We finally said the words we'd been living around, not as a press release, just in the kitchen with the kettle clicking off like it was keeping time. My parents said, "We want you here." Ruth said, "I am." I said, "Okay," like it was both a beginning and a continuation. We didn't move anything that day because most of it was already where it wanted to be. The trust settled into its new shape quietly. The lawyer sent a letter that sounded like a person likes commas. Ruth read it and said, "No footnotes." And I said, "Main text only." And we filed it where we keep things that are done. My parents didn't bring it up again. They brought up soup and snow and whether the mailbox needed straightening. It probably did. It probably always will. On the anniversary of the night on the porch, we didn't plan anything. It arrived anyway, like dates do. I noticed it in the way my chest felt when I passed the door. I noticed it in the way my mom touched the frame like she was checking for drafts and then didn't. I noticed it in the way Leela hung her backpack and didn't look back. Ruth noticed it too because she said, "It's been a year," like she was saying, "The kettle's on." We made dinner that took too long and then ate it like it was a holiday, even though nobody said so. My dad told a story about the old porch light, and my mom pretended to correct him and then let it go. Leela brought out the dinosaur postcard and the magnet and taped them back up, even though they'd never left. "Just checking," she said, and we understood. Later, when the house was quiet, in that way that feels earned, I stood by the door again. The same door, the hinges that didn't squeak, the light that didn't buzz. I remembered the cold in the way my daughter's face had folded into my coat and the way my own voice had tried to be steady and failed. I remembered Ruth's call and the sound of paper remembering. I remembered thinking that some things break and some things open, and sometimes it's the same moment. My mom came and stood next to me like she has learned to do. "We can't fix that night." I said, "We don't have to." She said, "I know." We stood there and listened to the house breathe and didn't try to organize it. In the spring, Leela planted Tuesday the plant in a bigger pot and said it was a promotion. The plant looked the same and also different, which felt accurate. My dad straightened the mailbox, and it leaned again by the next week, and he said, "We're in negotiations." My mom put up a calendar and forgot to write on it. Ruth kept the radio low, and sometimes turned it up and sometimes turned it off, and sometimes forgot it was there at all. I went back to the notebook and wrote more sentences that didn't need to be shown, about promises that sound like questions, about houses that learn, about the way forgiveness doesn't arrive like a parade, but like a bus you almost miss and then run for anyway. One evening, my mom brought out my old notebooks again and put them back where she'd found them, only this time she left one on the coffee table, "in case you want to write," she said, and then she pretended to look for something in the other room. I opened it and wrote a sentence about doors that become rooms if you stay long enough. I didn't show it to anyone. Some sentences are like seeds. You don't dig them up to see if they're working. We had dinner with Naomi's grandma, who brought a pie that had opinions. She said, "You all look settled," like it was a diagnosis. Ruth said, "We're practicing." And Naomi's grandma said, "That's how you get good at things." And then she asked for the radio to be turned up a little bit because she likes the weather told like a story. Leela served pie like she was in charge of a small, important institution. The snow melted into that gray honesty that winter does so well, and then one morning the crocuses showed up like punctuation. My dad said, "They're early." My mom said, "They're brave." Ruth said, "They're tired of waiting." Leela said, "They're like us," and nobody corrected her. We finally said the words we'd been living around, not as a press release, just in the kitchen with the kettle clicking off like it was keeping time. My parents said, "We want you here." Ruth said, "I am." I said, "Okay," like it was both a beginning and a continuation. We didn't move anything that day because most of it was already where it wanted to be. The trust settled into its new shape quietly. The lawyer sent a letter that sounded like a person likes commas. Ruth read it and said, "No footnotes." And I said, "Main text only." And we filed it where we keep things that are done. My parents didn't bring it up again. They brought up soup and snow and whether the mailbox needed straightening. It probably did. It probably always will. On the anniversary of the night on the porch, we didn't plan anything. It arrived anyway, like dates do. I noticed it in the way my chest felt when I passed the door. I noticed it in the way my mom touched the frame like she was checking for drafts and then didn't. I noticed it in the way Leela hung her backpack